Dess's second voice? Dess's second voice is a theory I like a lot. I think that's a pretty good theory. I think it's the second best second voice theory besides Kris. It would make sense. But that, to me, Dess' second voice is kind of tied with Death Knight. But to me, also, Death Knight only really makes sense if Kris and Dess were, like, kind of somehow working together up until this point. Like, so let's say Kris wasn't involved at first, but then Dess made... You know, let's put Death Knight in Awesome. Let's talk about Death Knight. Dess made Ralsei and put the soul inside Kris and is also the Knight. Let's say that. Right? And then when Kris and Ralsei talked with another behind our backs in chapter 1, Ralsei explained the situation and what's going on to Kris. And then Kris was like, oh, okay. Right on board. And then Ralsei would have had to tell Kris to make the chapter 3 fountain just to make things more convenient for Dess, I guess. Okay, so like, my second favorite Knight theory was right. And just to get this out of the way, yes, there is a small off detail in the clip I just played, in that Kris was working with Dess from the start, and not that Ralsei roped them into it. Which I think we can all agree is a very minor detail that really doesn't matter in terms of saying that the theory was right. But also more importantly, if you are now wondering how Ralsei does fit into all of this, and if he's involved, the answer is, it's complicated. Don't worry, I will get to it later. But yeah, my second favorite Knight theory, that being Kris Dess multi-Knight, was correct. My first favorite Knight theory being, of course, Kris Knight. Now why even bring this up? Why does this matter? Well, it's important because these two theories were pretty much almost identical to each other. They were about 90% the same, and the only really big difference between the two is that Kris doesn't make all of the fountains. And I feel like it will help me to explain the theory and make it more digestible if I just sit down and explain to everyone what Kris Knight would have entailed, and explain what we ended up with instead to really show how similar they are. So this is what Deltarune would have been if Kris was the Knight. So first off, Kris is the second voice, as in the person that cut off Gaster in the Goner Maker opening, who took the soul and put it inside Kris. Kris is making the fountains with the plan to use the soul to seal them in order to gain some kind of power or something like that. In order to achieve some goal that is probably to change their fate or fulfill the prophecy, save Dess, get their soul back from the player or Gaster, or get revenge on Gaster, or something like that. Really, any one of these things, or all of them, could have been the goal. Now what did we end up actually getting? Dess is the second voice, with the caveat that Kris was aware ahead of time that Dess was going to take the soul from Gaster and put it in them. This explanation is actually perfect, as it gives us all the benefits of Kris second voice, while also addressing one of the few big issues with Kris second voice, which is of course, how could Kris have even taken the soul from Gaster in the first place? Though now that I think about it, Kris can also just go into the shelter whenever they want, so maybe they are still the second voice. It doesn't really matter. They both clearly know about the soul and are using it for their plan, so it doesn't matter which one of them did it. But now, honestly, I kinda like the idea that they both did it, like they both just showed up to Gaster and beat him and the vessel up and stole the soul together. I'm choosing to believe that's what happened until new evidence is presented. Anyway, Kris and Dess are both making the fountains with the intent that Kris will use the soul to seal them, in order to gain some kind of power, or something like that. In order to achieve some goal, that is probably to change their fates or fulfill the prophecy, save Dess, get Kris's soul back from the player or Gaster, or get revenge on Gaster, or something like that. Really, any one of these things, or all of them, really could be the goal. And so yeah, that's pretty much the main differences between the two theories and stuff. The only other big difference is like character stuff and plot structure. But yes, in terms of functionality of the Knight and Soul plot lines, they are more or less mostly the same. They're both make fountains, use soul to seal them, question mark, question mark, question mark, profit. Why does any of this matter? Well, because it means that the videos and theories I made talking about the game's story if Kris was the Knight are still mostly relevant. And I mean that more so in the sense that the theories aren't completely wrong, just that they had some details off and now we just need to adjust them with the new info we have. Like I just did. The Ralsei videos, for example, are still relevant. You just need to add "and Dess" every time I talk about Kris doing something in them. Now, a part of me feels like I might be under-explaining some things. So I think it's a good idea to explain the theory in much greater detail and cover the other important stuff that I didn't mention. So let's start at the inciting incident of the story that happened years before the start of the game. Let's cover the shelter incident. Now, I have talked about this before in this video, and honestly very little has actually changed, but I'm sure you either didn't watch that video or don't remember it. And we now have more information about what happened, so it's mostly the same theory, just more refined with that new info. As I feel like I got really close on my first guess. Also keep in mind that when I give the explanation, that the details of the event are not super important. Most details about it are up in the air, and can be adjusted without massive changes to this theory and the game's story. So Kris and Dess were playing in the woods one day. Personally, I think they were going icy cryptid hunting, but again, the exact reason why they were there doesn't matter. Then it started to rain or snow, so they ran into the shelter for cover. But Gaster had just made his first Dark World in the shelter, likely earlier that day, and they both fell in. They followed the Tale of Hell, which is probably Friend, and that led them to Gaster. Then, Entry 17 happens. And yes, the two people Gaster talked to in Entry 17 are Kris and Dess. Then, after that, something happens that causes Dess to be trapped in the Shelter Dark World and Kris to lose their soul somehow. Most likely either by trading it to Gaster or Friend in exchange for something, or Gaster or Friend just stole it straight up. There's other possible ways Kris could have lost their soul, but the important part is that they lost it and have been living soulless until the start of the game, when the soul gets put into Kris. Over the course of that time, Dess is trapped in the Dark World and turns into the Knight somehow. Also, as a result of this event, they were both Gaster-pilled and gained all the meta-knowledge and information about the Dark Worlds they would need to be the Knights. And then sometime before the start of the game, Kris finds Dess in the shelter after she turned into the Knight. And then both of them decide to do this whole Knight conspiracy plan for some reason. That reason, of course, being whatever goal they are trying to achieve. It's also possible that Carol found Dess first, if she's also in on everything, or that Dess somehow broke out of the shelter alone and then found Kris, but I feel that's a bit less likely, but it also doesn't really matter either way. Now before moving on, I want to touch on the possible ways that Dess turned into the Knight, as in how Dess went from a normal teenage monster to whatever this thing is. I've been thinking a lot about this and have considered a bunch of different ideas. I even thought of making a video going over all the different ideas I came up with, which I might still make if people are interested. But in case I never get around to it, I do want to at least share my personal favorite idea about how Dess turned into the Knight. Also, I want to state that this theory about how Dess became the Knight isn't super important to the overall theory. The details could be off, and we can still come to more or less the same conclusion. So if we assume the voice in the code is supposed to be Dess in the past when she first got lost in the Dark World, then that would mean that she was wandering around the Dark World alone before getting turned into the Knight. So what I think happened to her is that shortly after getting lost in the Dark World, likely within the first couple of days, she got attacked by a Titan spawn. Because remember, in Chapter 4 it shows us that they can just spawn in very dark places in a normal Dark World without a full Titan being made first. So she got attacked by the Titan spawn, and the Titan took her soul and absorbed it. Now it's important to remember that Ralsei says that the Titans have no consciousness, but Dess's soul clearly would contain her conscious, so when the Titan absorbed it, the only consciousness that would be inside the Titan would be Dess's. So Dess has full control of the Titan's body, which explains why the Knight is both so clearly some kind of Titan thing, and also so clearly Dess. Alternatively, instead of a Titan that took her soul, it could be a Darkner made from her knife. While she does look like a Titan, the Shadow guys are also just normal Darkners that happen to look like Titans, so the Knight could just be a Darkner made of Dess's knife with her soul. This would explain the black knife stuff better, while being more or less the same theory. However, there would be one big difference, that being that Darkners do have consciousnesses, so the Knight would have a split mind between Dess and the Knife Darkener. Now, even if this was the case, I do think that Dess would be the dominant one in this theory. But really, besides that, they're more or less the same theory. And both have the same upside of explaining how Dess would be able to live in the Dark World for years, as her Titan or Darkener body would probably be immortal and not require any food or water to survive. And that having a Lightner soul would allow her to be in the Light World. So for the majority of the time Dess was lost, she was actually just walking around in the Dark World with her new fancy Titan body, probably killing other Titan spawns for about 5 or 6 years until Kris found her. I'm guessing it simply took that long for Kris to figure out the shelter codes and get the courage to go back and look for her. And then they found her, and they both immediately decided to do this weird doomsday conspiracy plan. I really like this theory because I think the idea that Kris lost their soul in the shelter and Dess lost her body is a compelling idea that has their shared suffering be mirrored in this way. And with this, their main goal of the plan can be to try and save each other, with Kris trying to get a new body for Dess, and Dess trying to get Kris's soul back for them. But before I get into details surrounding the Night Plan, I feel like it's important to cover a few more things first. But now that the shelter incident is covered, and I've covered Dess becoming the Knight, I can now give a full explanation of the intro and second voice. So at the start of the game, Gaster connects us to what is most likely Kris's soul that he stole or traded for from Kris. It's also possible that this is a new soul that he just made somehow, but honestly it's not super important, so don't worry about it right now. Anyway, he connects us to the soul, and then we make a vessel with him that the soul is meant to go into. And then right at the very end, someone else cuts us off, discards the vessel, and then puts us inside Kris. And as I have already mentioned earlier, this person is Dess and/or Kris, and they both knew about it even if the other wasn't directly involved. We know that Kris knew that this would happen for a couple big reasons. First off, throughout the whole game they show a clear understanding of how the soul works. Most importantly, they know that the soul is the thing that is controlling them, which is demonstrated by the fact that they know how to remove the soul, and that doing so will give them control back. And we know that they knew that the soul was coming with the fact that they have the bird cage in their room that they only use to trap the soul. This item is much too weird to just have for no reason, and since they only use it to trap the soul, it's safe to say that Kris put it in their room recently before the start of the game because, again, they knew we were coming. The phone caller also mentions the soul and how Kris needs it, clearly showing that using the soul is an important part of the Night Plan, and something they need for the plan to work, confirming that Kris and/or the Knight is the second voice. And with the phone calls being mentioned, now is a great time to give a full overview of them. So in Chapter 4, Kris gets 3 different phone calls, one where the person on the phone is discussing the Night Plan while Kris gets Choco Milk, one after Susie gets Dess's guitar, where the caller says they'll be right there, and the final one reminding Kris of their promise right before Kris climbs out of their window. It's important to note that on the weird route, this last phone call doesn't happen. Instead, you get a completely different phone call from Carol asking to confirm that Kris is going to the festival with Noelle. This call is completely different and uses normal text boxes, while all the other ones use these action speech bubbles. It's also the only call that we can confirm is from Carol. One last important thing to note about the phone calls is that the kitchen one and the one at the end of the chapter are done from speakerphone, while the call in the closet and the weird root call from Carol are not done on speakerphone, as Kris is clearly holding the phone up to their ear. So of course the question is who is on the phone, and while I would love to just say the spooky caller is Dess, and just leave it at that, it is actually a bit more complex than that if you actually want to consider all the possible answers. So I'm going to try to go over all the different possible ways this could play out, while trying to keep things as simple as possible. Now the first step we need to ask, is Carol also in on the conspiracy? As in, she is fully in on it 100%, maybe even masterminding the whole thing. Now this is too complex of a topic to cover in this video, and really probably deserves its own video, so for the time being, we're just going to leave this as a yes or no. If the answer is no, then the question really does end here. The spooky caller has to be Dess all 3 times, and only the normal call in Weirdroot is Carol. Now I'm sure some people are thinking, well, what about that second call? That one really seems to be Carol. Well, in this explanation, Kris is calling Dess to make the fountain early, and that's what the "I'll be right there" means. And Carol coming home early is just like a coincidence or something, a red herring if you will. But if the answer is yes, then we start getting a lot more options. One of which is that it's still Dess the whole time. Because yes, Carol can be in on everything, and still not be in any of the phone calls. The other options though is where we start getting complex. The first one being group call theory, in which all of these calls were part of a group call between Kris, Dess, and Carol. However, it's possible that only some of these calls are group calls. Like for example, it's possible that the first call is a group call, the second call is just to Carol, and the third call is just from the night. Now I'm sure you can think of all the different possible ways this could work out, but for the sake of not wasting everyone's time, I believe that the most likely answer is just the first one, that the caller is just Dess all 3 times. But my second guess is the example I gave for how the group call could be divided up, with the first call being both and the last call being just Dess. I'm going to be touching back on these calls a few times throughout the video, so that's why it's important to cover them. But one more thing I want to mention about these calls, about the last call specifically at the end of the chapter, this call only happens when Kris goes up to the window, as Kris doesn't go up to the window in the weird route, and this call never happens. And the call seems to be in response to what Kris is currently doing, which begs the question, can Dess see what Kris is doing right now? And if so, how? Is she hiding in the bushes outside the house? If it's not something silly like that, then I would have to assume that they have some sort of special magic, psychic, or spiritual connection that lets her see what Kris is doing somehow. But also, this connection doesn't let them communicate, as they still need the phone to talk to each other. Which I feel like could have a lot of important implications if it's meant to be true, and could end up being plot relevant as well. If I had to take a guess about how this is working, Dess can somehow see what Kris is doing through the soul, as in she can somehow see with the soul, the same way we can. If this is correct, it can also explain the first call, as Dess would be calling Kris about why they took the soul out. And this is why she mentions the soul and how Kris needs it for the Dark Worlds. How she's able to do this is anyone's guess, but I do think it's the most likely answer and makes sense. And it seems like Ralsei might also be able to do this, but it's not clear. Also, one more thing about the phones I just wanted to mention, how funny it is to think about the knight using their phone to call Kris, because I just have to wonder how all of this is working. Is she using the same phone she had when she got lost in the Dark World years ago, or did Kris get her a new one before the start of the story? Yeah, I get the feeling that Toby didn't really think about this, and I will never get an answer to this question. Anyway, next point. Why is Kris being controlled by the soul so important to their plan? Well, the primary reason, as stated earlier, is that Kris needs the soul to seal the fountains. Ralsei states that the soul is the only thing that can seal the fountains, and the caller on the phone, who as we just discussed, is at least Dess, also talks about Kris not being able to go into the Dark Worlds without it. However, it's not clear if the caller's concern is only in regards to needing the soul to seal the fountains, or if something bad will happen to Kris if they simply enter the Dark World soulless. If both are true, then it does open up a lot of different avenues of thought. Like, we could theorize that a Lightner being in the Dark World soulless does something to them. I know I said that my favorite theory regarding how Dess turned into the Knight was a Titan spawn stealing her soul. But I would like to propose an alternative to that theory that I also like based on this idea. What if what actually happened to Dess in the Dark World is that she lost her soul somehow, and then her soulless body turned into the Knight? In a way, it's kind of the opposite of my first theory. And the point being is that if this is true, then that means that if Kris were to enter the Dark World soulless, then they would turn into a weird Titan thing just like Dess. Which, if true, could end up being a plot point later. I do feel like it's worth pointing out that the cutscene in Chapter 2 that explains the roaring features 2 suspiciously knight-shaped titans. Also, if this is true, then it could mean that Kris and Dess are trying to find Dess's soul, which could give us an explanation for the whole find her lost girl stuff. They are trying to find her lost soul. But that's just one possible idea. This line could just be referring to how Kris can't seal the fountains without the soul, which again is clearly an important part of the Knight plan, as Kris so far has sealed every fountain that has been made, and is clearly working with the Knight, so it's clear that making them and then sealing them is just the core idea of the plan. But what is it that they are actually trying to achieve by doing all of this? What are their goals? Well, I already made that chart, didn't I? So let's just pull that back up. Change their fate or fulfill the prophecy, save Dess, get Kris's soul back, get revenge on Gaster or Friend, or maybe even something else. Now for this part, I really want to emphasize that this is not one perfectly constructed theory, but merely a collection of possible ideas that need to be considered. It's also important to remember that the plan can have multiple goals. It's 100% possible that all of these are true all at the same time. So I'm just going to list off a bunch of different ideas for what I think they might be trying to do and why, and if I'm lucky, maybe like half of them will be right. So let's start off with the prophecy stuff. The big question regarding this is, does Kris and Dess want to fulfill the prophecy or change it? While the answer might seem obvious, it's actually quite complicated. For one, they are making the fountains, and are clearly following the prophecy. So from that, it's clear that they want to fulfill the prophecy, right? Which could make a lot of sense. The ending of the prophecy says the world is saved, so outside of the final tragedy, nothing bad seems to really happen. Plus, it's not much of a stretch to think that there could be a part of the prophecy that Kris and Dess know of, that we don't, that states that something good will happen to the Cage and Knight. If that's the case, then it could make a lot of sense why they are fulfilling the prophecy. However, there is a big important point that makes things more complex. That being the Gonnermaker intro and the second voice. Because of this, we know that Kris isn't actually meant to be the cage with human soul and parts. The vessel is. Dess and or Kris being the second voice means that they actively change things to make Kris the first hero instead of the vessel. And this is kind of a big deal, right? I mean, sure, they need Kris in this role in order for the plan to work, but this also shows that they are not following the original prophecy, but one that has been at least slightly altered. Which means on some level, they are trying to change fate. And the fact that we know that people that fill the roles can change means it's possible that Susie and Ralsei also aren't the original girl and Prince of the Dark. With this idea in mind, it's possible that Kris and Dess replace the original girl with Susie. But why? Why would they do that? And if they did, then who was the original girl? It was Noelle. It was obviously Noelle. If this theory is correct, it would almost definitely be Noelle. As for why they might do this, well, if they know that the girl dying is part of the final tragedy, that it would make sense that they would swap out Noelle for Susie. And that a big part of the plan is giving Susie a character arc for her to be the hero, so she will do the big heroic sacrifice instead of Noelle. I mean, it's either that, or they actually do have faith that Susie can just no-diff the prophecy, which is actually what they want her to do. Or, you know, the theory could just be wrong. Again, this is just one idea. Also, this is relevant to everything I'm going to say in this part, but just because Kris and Dess are planning something doesn't mean that plan will actually work out and that Susie won't stop them. But now let's talk about what they are likely doing to save themselves. To try and keep things simple, based on my theory that the Knight is Dess's soul in a Titan or Darkener body, the end goal is likely to both get a new body for Dess and to get Kris's soul back. But how could they possibly go about doing these things? Well, for getting Kris's soul back, it's pretty simple. If we assume that the soul we are controlling is Kris's soul, then whatever we need to do to end the game will remove the player's control over the soul, leaving Kris with their soul back after the game ends. This is likely connected to the whole banishing the angels' heaven stuff, and would explain why they are enacting the prophecy. As for the problems with Dess, that's a bit more complex. Regarding how they might go about trying to fix her, what exactly is wrong with her, and how the magic system works matters a lot, which we don't have a full understanding of. But working off the theory stated earlier, here's what I think they might be trying to do. So we know that we are using the soul to seal the fountains, and we also know that we can use the light in the soul to banish the Titan spawns, and we even use it to seal the Titan. There's also the importance of power in relation to the soul. And by doing the Dark World adventures, the soul seems to be getting more powerful, as the party gains levels after we finish them. So what if the idea is that we are trying to power up the soul to be able to banish Dess's Titan body, which would then let them get Dess's soul back. Once Dess's soul is back, they can then put it into a new body, which could be maybe a vessel that Gaster makes or they steal from him, or maybe that's what the police sacrifice is for. As in, they're going to have Dess steal Undying's body, or use her body to make a new body for Dess, kind of like a sausage. This could be what Gaster's meat factory is about, or explain the goners and vessels. But if that really is the plan, to have Dess steal Undying's body specifically, I highly doubt that's actually going to work. Like, it's way too crazy to have that work out, so if they are trying to do that, Susie will pretty much for sure stop them. Overall, while it's very hard to guess how they are going to try and fix Dess, and I can only throw so many guesses in a single video, I do want to state that I think fixing Dess is most likely one of their main goals. Okay, now for the final goal on the list, beating up Friend and Gaster. Honestly, I don't have a lot to say on this one. I just think if they have beef with one or both of them, then kicking their butts would probably be on the list of things to do. You know, it just makes sense that they would want to do that, maybe? I mean, it will probably happen, because I, the player, want to fight them, and I think Toby knows that, so he'll probably make it happen. Probably. So one last thing I want to say about the Knight's goals, I just want to acknowledge the fact that the Knight's goal is not to cause the roaring. If they wanted to do that, they would have done so 8 times over by now, and they wouldn't be getting Kris to seal the fountains. Even if at some point they do start the roaring, clearly the plan would be for the heroes to simply stop it to save the world, just like the prophecy says will happen. Also in a similar vein, I don't think they are trying to kidnap Toriel, but they do want Susie to think they are trying to kidnap Toriel. Undying, on the other hand, was the actual target the whole time, as shown with the police sacrifice next week. Now, before I can continue the video, I have something important to say regarding the future of this channel. This channel is not monetized. Despite the fact that the channel meets the requirements to be monetized, Google has permanently demonetized my channel by banning my AdSense account after their terrible AI false flagged me for invalid click activity 5 days after my channel was monetized. Which is a thing they define as like 5 different things, so I don't even know what they're actually accusing me of doing. And again, keep in mind they flagged my channel after only 5 days, so I don't even know what I could have possibly done in that time to warrant a permanent ban. I've tried to appeal this, but of course it's functionally impossible. The whole system is a complete catch-22. There's basically nothing I can do to reverse this. And this means that I spent the last 7 to 8 months making this massive 2-hour video, knowing that no matter how well it did, even if it got a ton of views, that I would never make a penny off of it. Which is why I'm begging you to please give me money. This took a long time to make. It was a lot of work, you know. But for real, if you like the video and want to see more, please consider supporting me on Ko-Fi or Patreon. If you support me monthly, you will get a shout out at the end of the next video, and also sneak peeks at upcoming content. Of course, if you only want to give me a one-time tip on Ko-Fi, that's fine too. Also, I have a Discord server that you can join if you want to chat with me and other people about Deltarune. And if you support me on Ko-Fi or Patreon, you will get a special role in the Discord server as well. I might do more with the Patreon and Ko-Fi, like offering exclusive content or something like that in the future, But that will depend on how well this video does. So if you are enjoying the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and all that fun stuff. But anyway, back to the video. So for the rest of the video, I'm just going to be talking about Kris and Dess and their relationship. There will be some theory stuff and speculation here and there, but for the most part, it's going to be a character analysis. And I'm going to start this off by playing a short clip from one of my older videos where I talk about this topic before the chapters came out. Honestly, I think Kris and Dess's relationship will be very important to the story. I think they were fairly close. I think Kris was better friends with Dess than they ever were with Noelle. We've been told so little about Dess to the point where the only really concrete thing we know about her is that she played guitar. And one of the main things we were told about Kris is that they play piano. And honestly, I would be surprised if they didn't play music together. Like looking back at the Spamton sweepstakes, specifically the one Noelle post about Kris playing piano at her house and then stopping when Noelle walks into the room, a lot of people are still questioning the meaning of this. And what do I think about it? I think this is about Dess. I think Kris used to play music with Dess at Noelle's house, and what Kris is doing in this post is them reminiscing about this. I think this will be really important. I've made a lot of theories back in the Chapter 2 days. Some of them are wrong, and a decent amount of them were right actually. Like my Chapter 4 prediction was the most accurate Chapter 4 prediction by far, at least on YouTube. Sure, some of the details were off, but that's to be expected. And when just looking at the broad strokes, it was undeniably correct. And I'm very happy it was. Nobody wanted to see that Gerson boss fight more than me. But there was no theory that I wanted to be true more than this one. And it's really crazy because this wasn't like a safe bet or anything. I wasn't even that confident that it would be true. I just really wanted it to be. Come near the end of the Chapter 2 days, the idea that Kris and Dess were really close, and that Kris's main motivation for doing all the night stuff was Dess, and that she had a big impact on Kris, was an idea I was deeply invested in. And it ended up being even more true than I thought it would be. And I can't even begin to express how happy I'm about it. Like, it's so much more than I thought it would be. It's not just that they played music together, it's everything. And by everything, I mean the whole game revolves around it. All the Dark Worlds, the plot, everything that is happening and the reason for it comes back to them. But before I go any further, I do think it's important to cover some of the basic timeline of events and give a rough estimate on the characters' ages. This is important to understanding Kris and Dess's relationship, as depending on the age gap, it changes the dynamic. And I've seen a lot of people confused about it, so I think it's important to go over. So let's start with what we can say with a near 100% confidence. Dess and Asriel should be about 18 or 19 years old currently. We know this as Burger Pants in Undertale states that he is 19 years old, and Pizza Pants in Deltarune seems to be about the exact same age. 18 or 19 years of age also lines up with the grade that Asriel is currently in, as he is a freshman at college not having waited any time to go. So now on to the much more speculative work of trying to figure out the ages of the main class. Now keep in mind these are just my estimates and opinions based on the information in the game. I'm sure a lot of people will disagree with my assessment, and that's fine. I'm simply going to try and make the best argument I can for what I think their ages are meant to be. So I think it would be easiest to simply start with how old I think they are, and then work backwards going over the reasons why I came to that conclusion. I think they are meant to be about 16 or 17. And I think they're in their senior or junior year of high school. So the age gap between the siblings should be somewhere between 1 to 3 years. Now, as for the evidence for why I believe this, Caddy has a part-time job, which points to them being older teens. Birdley also has a part-time job working with Miss Boom, as well as volunteering at the library. There's also the dialogue regarding them going to college soon. Toriel in Chapter 1 says Kris will be joining Asriel in college soon, and Temmie also talks about doing college prep, which supports the idea of them being juniors or seniors, as it wouldn't make sense to do or say these things if they were below that grade. Also, in Chapter 4, Susie talks about taking Toriel's car to go street racing. Does this mean that Kris and Susie know how to drive? Kris does drive Queen's car in Chapter 2. You could say that we are driving, but Queen tells Kris to drive, so she must think that Kris knows how to drive, right? If we are meant to believe that Kris does know how to drive and has their license, then that would definitely put them in the older teen ranges. Granted, that last point about driving might be a bit questionable, but I feel the other points are strong enough on their own to prove my argument. Now, in terms of the timeline of events regarding how old Dess was when she disappeared, there are two main points that show us how old she would have been, those being the How to Draw Dragons book and Kris's red horn headband. So, for the How to Draw Dragons book, we are told by Birdley that the book is 2,583 days overdue, which adds up to about 7 years. This book is something that Kris and/or Azriel used in relation to Dess, as we can find a poorly drawn dragon under Dess's bed. If we assume them not returning the book for so long has some connection to Dess going missing, then this would explain why Toriel is very aware of this book and is perfectly okay with them never returning it. Then this gives us a time frame for when Dess disappeared. It couldn't have been more than 7 years, and it was likely around 6 or 7 years. You assume that Dess is currently about 18 or 19 years old, minus 6 or 7, would put her around 13 when she disappeared. Now that's not all, as Kris's red horn headband also points to this being around the age she was when she disappeared. We learn in Chapter 1 that Kris asked Toriel when their horns would grow in, and then because of this, Toriel bought Kris the red horn headband. How does this connect to the timeline? Well, first, we can see Kris wearing the headband in Tenna's flashback from when Dess disappeared. And this matters because Toriel said that Kris wore the headband for months, not years. So it means that the time in which Kris wore the headband was less than a year. It would make sense that they asked when their horns would grow in because Azriel's horns started to grow in. And this matters because Azriel would have had his horns start to grow in when he started going through puberty, which would line up with him being around 13 years old. And this would put Kris and Noelle as being about 10 or 11 in this flashback. When it comes to why I'm spending so much time breaking all of this down, it's because 1, I feel like I see a ton of people disagreeing on the age gap, so I felt it was important to go over it thoroughly. And 2, I feel that knowing what the age gap is again important for understanding the dynamic between Kris and Dess and what their relationship is like. Because depending on the age gap, it drastically changes how one views their interactions. Because if Dess is meant to be like 5+ years older than Kris, then her, say, hitting Kris over the head with a plastic bat for telling Noelle ghost stories, and her showing them inappropriate music videos, looks much worse and paints Dess in a worse light than if she is only about 2 give or take years older than Kris. There's absolutely more that could be said regarding this, but I don't want to spend more time than I have to on the topic. But now that this is out of the way, we can finally move on to actually talking about Kris and Dess. So let's start with the main things we know about Dess, as in the stuff the game is not at all subtle about with her. 1, she played multiple different sports, mostly ones with sticks involved. These include baseball, hockey, maybe also figure skating, and also paintball. 2, she was very into music, both playing and listening, of course. She had a drum set, trumpet, guitar, piano, violin, flute, and microphone. It's not clear, however, how proficient she was with all of these different instruments. It's possible that while owning all of these, she only really knew how to play a few of them. 3, she is Noelle's sister, and was very close friends with Kris and Azriel, as Noelle states that all 4 of them would play together. It's safe to say that this was a fairly regular thing. Of the activities they did together, Noelle points out playing in the woods, so this is probably fairly important and something Dess would have done more than once. Now obviously there is a ton more about her character, and I will get into all the details later, but I wanted to start by listing off the basics about her character that I'm sure most people already know and agree with first. Now as for the basic stuff regarding Kris, their room in Queen's Mansion actually just more or less lists most of the basics for us. They play a lot of pranks and are mischievous, they are interested in knives, they play the piano, they have studied magic, they miss their brother, or at least are interested in when he's coming home. But I'm sure you already knew that. But when it comes to Kris and Dess's relationship, they don't have too many confirmed interactions with each other, and even less so just between the two of them. There's how Noelle talks about all four of them playing in the woods, as just mentioned, Dess hitting Kris with a plastic bat for teasing Noelle, and Dess showing Kris inappropriate music videos on MTV. This was apparently a big enough deal and/or happened enough times that Toriel added a parental lock to the TV, with the code being 1225. Now there is of course one more that, while not confirmed, might as well be in my eyes. And this one is the big one. And by big one, I mean the most important line of dialogue in the whole game, at least within the topic of this video. But before I even get to the line, I want to give a big thank you to Ram for giving us it. Thank you, Ram, for dropping this massive lore nuke and then dying. Despite having only 3 minutes of screen time, you still somehow managed to be the best new character in the chapter, carried mostly by this interaction. Now obviously I'm talking about this dialogue here. Time flies. Seems like just yesterday you and that girl had everyone lined up. Queen on her side, king on your side, Tenna in back. Oh, it was chaos, chaos. Only kids like you two would take a laptop home just to play make-believe. How is she? Kris, are you too... Well, it's alright. Everyone changes. Except us. I don't even know where to start when it comes to how big of a deal this is. Like, this basically reframes the entirety of the first 3 chapters, and as such shows us what the game's plot and story are actually about. But before I get into the details regarding it, there is something important to clear up about this dialogue. I've seen a lot of people mistake the girl that Ram is talking about to be Noelle. Which is a fair mistake to make. I also thought this was about Noelle when I first played the chapter. But after looking back with the context of the full game so far, I can say with 100% confidence that the girl is in fact Dess. And I can explain why. First off, it doesn't make sense for the girl to be Noelle, as if she was Noelle, then her reaction to the Chapter 2 Dark World doesn't make sense, as she should recognize the fact that all of the Darkners are actually her old OCs. And second, it makes way more sense that the Knight is making Dark Worlds based on her own childhood games than if she was making them based on her younger sister's games that she just happens to be super familiar with for some reason. And if the girl was actually Noelle, then there really wouldn't be a good reason to not just have Ram say Noelle's name. There's no reason to add ambiguity if it's just talking about Noelle, which is likely most people's first assumption anyway. And overall, it's just so much better if the girl is Dess. Like, I need to emphasize, it's so important to this game's story that the girl is Dess. I'm not exaggerating when I say that this dialogue straight up makes the game like 80% better by its mere existence. It reframes the first 2 chapters as actually being this children's game played between Kris and Dess brought to life, and really sells the idea that the connection between the 2 characters defines the plot, and showcases how important they are to each other. That even after all these years, the first thing they do after being reconnected is go right back to playing the same game they were playing as children. This also may give us a better view into how the Dark Worlds are supposed to work, in regards to the quote-unquote Wheel of the Fountain. So in Chapter 2, Ralsei says that Darkners are based on the Will of the Fountain, and Queen says that the Knight courses its will into its blade to make the fountains, showing that the Knight's will affects the Dark Worlds. But with this new information from Ram, we learn that this will is not simply the Knight's will, but a shared mutual will between Kris and Dess. And this explains why Kris's Dark World is so similar to Dess's Dark World, and has so many Darkners that were also in the first 2 Dark Worlds. This is also important to the prophecy in some ways. Based on what we know, it's safe to say that they based this game off Dragon Blazers, And we know that Dragon Blazers is based on the Lord of the Hammer. And we know that Lord of the Hammer is based on the prophecy, which in turn makes the whole prophecy self-fulfilling. This dialogue also points to the idea that Kris and Dess would specifically do a lot of things together, just the two of them, and not just when Noelle and Azrael were also there. Which points to the two of them having a special connection that was more than just being in this sibling friend group. And with this idea in mind, we can then ask what other activities they could have done together with just the two of them. Well, one activity we can say with confidence the two of them did together was playing music. I know I started this character analysis by playing an old clip of me guessing this point and then guessing that the main plot would focus on their relationship, and you know I was right, but there is absolutely much more to say about this point than just that they played music together. Dess is shown to have multiple different instruments, and while it's not clear how good she actually was with each of them, Tenna does call her a musical prodigy, and for this point, the only instrument that really matters is the piano. I think it's very safe to say that Dess at least started to teach Kris how to play the piano, and that playing music together was something the two of them bonded over. Kris playing the piano is something they likely connect to Dess, and something they continue to do even after Dess went missing. And with the piano tutorial search, we can see Kris is still trying to teach themselves more even after Dess disappeared, highlighting how much of an impact Dess made on Kris and how Kris uses the piano to keep her memory alive. I said before the chapters came out that Kris playing the piano at Noelle's house when Noelle wasn't looking was Kris reminiscing about Dess. And then in chapter 4, we see them go and play the piano while alone in Noelle's house. And when do they go to play piano? Right after getting off the phone with Dess. This musical connection is highlighted even greater when you look at the music in the game itself, with both of the songs in the game with lyrics being about their relationship and how it will impact the plot. So let's take a look at Don't Forget and Raise Up Your Bat. Now for Raise Up Your Bat, all of the lyrics are important, but the bridge is where the really important lyrics are, so we'll start with them first. So let me break this down. Come follow me into the dark. Right off the bat, this is Dess calling for Kris to follow her into the dark. This is both calling back to the original incident where they fell into the first Dark World, and also to how, even now, years later, Dess is still calling Kris back into the dark with her. With your heart as the arc which shall shine you the way. The word arc here is important, as it has religious connotations, with the biblical story of Noah's Ark. But the important part is that the word ark means a vessel or sanctuary that serves as protection against extinction. Between this and the phone caller saying, "Without soul, Kris will," we can infer that the soul is of great importance to protecting Kris in the Dark Worlds. With the shine you the way / guide you the way through the waves line implying to the light inside the soul, which is most likely connected to the player, as we are controlling Kris and guiding them through the Dark Worlds and protecting them from harm, even so much as reverting time to prevent their death. And with the "because I'm with you in the dark, with your heart as my mark," the first half of this doubles down on the idea of Dess being with Kris in the dark, ensuring them that they will be with them in the dark and not abandon them. And with the heart as my mark line is referring to how Dess's goal is Kris's heart, or soul for this matter, that her objective is something to do with Kris's soul, which connects to what I stated earlier, that Dess is trying to remove the player from Kris's soul so she can return it back to Kris, and points to her being the second voice for this reason. But now what about the other lyrics? So first off, gonna keep it real, I don't know what the demon heart is. And what I mean by that is that there are so many different things it could be that I don't know which one it's supposed to be. Like, this could be Kris's soul, or maybe it's Dess's soul, or maybe it's about friend. Heck, it could even be talking about Ralsei or Eram for all I know. And just sitting here being like, who is the demon? Why is their heart crying? Is it Kara? It better not be Kara. Okay, with that being said, maybe it doesn't matter that much, and we can still try and put things together, without being confident in what the demon heart is meant to be referring to. Because just ignoring that line, the rest of the verse is pretty straightforward and shows off Dess's character. It shows off that Dess doesn't give up without a fight, and that Dess is not a pacifist, that her first response to a problem is to hit it till it dies. Which is pretty similar to how Susie was back in Chapter 1. The song also says to keep fighting even if you have lost hope and your fate is sealed, and your future is doomed, which points to the idea of Dess being someone who would fight against the prophecy and her doomed fate, refusing to accept it, which does seem contrary to her current actions as the knight, but maybe that's the idea, and Dess as the knight isn't really the same person as she used to be. Or maybe the knight is already changing fate in some way. But a little bonus about Raise Up Your Bat that's not really related to Dess, but how the characters play the minigame shows how they follow the prophecy. Susie ignores the chart completely and does her own thing, causing her to get X'd out. Kris follows the chart to the best of the player's ability, while Ralsei does the chart perfectly while changing the lyrics to be nicer, just like how he tries to change the prophecy and tells you a watered-down version of the prophecy with a different wording in Chapter 1. Oh, so Ralsei singing the Kids Bop version of Raise Up Your Bat is objectively hilarious, and maybe the funniest joke ever. Now, as for Don't Forget, while I feel this is also true for Raise Up Your Bat, I feel this even stronger with Don't Forget, that the song is meant to be Dess singing to Kris. Especially with the Chapter 4 ending actively invoking Don't Forget, which is why I feel so confident in saying that Dess is the one singing Don't Forget to Kris, and that she is the person on the phone as well. But let's just go over the song now, and then try to piece this all together into something that I hope by the end actually makes sense. Now this first line is pretty simple, I'm sure most people get this right away. It's simply referring to the Dark Worlds and maybe the Roaring. The light inside the soul is of course referring to, well, the light inside the soul, which becomes very clearly visible in Chapter 4. Though really it's been here since at least the start of the game. I personally believe that the light is somehow connected to the player, and is meant to be a representation of us. And I should probably explain how I came to that idea. Basically, the game makes the idea that the Dark Worlds are fake, while the Light World is meant to be real, correlating the idea that light is meant to be reality, and dark is meant to be fiction. That the more light something is, the more real it is, and the more dark something is, the more fake it is. That the light inside the soul is something special, and has the ability to seal fountains and banish the darkness. That it would make sense that it's somehow connected directly to the player, who is the most real thing in the game, and is directly controlling the soul. However, the rest of the song makes everything more complicated. With the truth, the promise in our hearts, don't forget, I'm with you in the dark, which states that the light inside the soul is shining with the truth, which is the promise in our hearts, our of course being Kris and Dess. And then the promise is what? I'm with you in the dark? Or is it meant to be something else? And if the light is actually the player, then how and why would it be shining with the truth? I honestly feel like this is the most important point in the whole video, and frankly probably the whole game, and it's the one where I both feel like I'm going insane thinking about it, and that I'm totally overthinking it. But let me see if I can explain this in a way that actually makes sense. Let's start with the promise stuff. The promise in our hearts. Our hearts meaning that the promise made was a mutual one between Kris and Dess. And if the promise is more than just simply to be with each other in the dark, then what is it? Well, based on the Chapter 4 ending, one could assume that the promise is to do the night plan with each other. And that can make sense if we assume this promise was made after Dess got lost in the dark and Kris found her. But what if this promise was made before that? Before Dess went missing, or was made right after they fell into the Dark World? What could the promise be then? To always be with each other? I guess that lines up close enough to the I'm with you in the dark line. But overall, I feel like the promise has to be something simple, but also complex and multifaceted. Like the words stay the same, but the meaning of the promise changes over time. So maybe the promise really is to just be with each other in the dark. But maybe I'm coming at this from the wrong angle. Maybe it doesn't really matter about the details of the promise and the exact words that were said. Maybe the actually important part is just the fact that they made this promise between each other. Because that alone showcases a level of importance to each other, and the fact that this promise is a mutual one, to me highlights their relationship with each other. I've seen a lot of people saying that the promise line from the phone is guilt-tripping Kris. I've even seen some say that Kris is being blackmailed or forced to work with the knight against their will. I feel like this is just wrong. At most, I'm willing to believe that Kris is somewhat being guilt-tripped, but that Dess genuinely feels that Kris owes her because of the promise they made to her. But overall, I absolutely believe that they both care deeply about each other, and are both trying to save each other. And the "I'm with you in the dark" line, being in both Raise Up Your Bat and Don't Forget, clearly being sung by Dess to Kris, to me really highlights how much Dess cares about Kris, and how she is committed to being with them. As for how this connects back to the light inside the soul and the player, and us shining with the truth, after thinking about it and coming back to this, it's probably just connected to how Dess is the second voice, and put the player-controlled soul inside Kris, which Raise Up Your Bat was also teasing. So yeah, no matter what the exact words of the promise were, it's 100% central to the Night Plan and the emotional core of Kris and Dess's story. Which is why I think writing it off as blackmail is so unappealing to me, as it's just throwing away the emotional investments the characters have with each other. But while we are still talking about Kris and Dess's musical connection, there's one other song I want to talk about, that being Lost Girl and its variants. Lost Girl gets played in a bunch of different times throughout the game, most of which don't really have anything to do with Dess, though it's clear just based on the name that the song is mostly about her, just not exclusively about her. But there's actually one specific version of this song that I really want to talk about. That being the version of Lost Girl that plays when you're in Dess's room, with its name being The Distance Between Two. The title is about Kris and Dess. I know a lot of people assume that it's about the distance between Kris and the soul, since it also plays when you're in the vents, and that might be a double meaning with it, but I'm very confident that the core meaning is about Kris and Dess. It literally plays when Kris is in Dess's room alone. Dess is supposed to be here with Kris, but she's not. Hence, the distance between two. I feel both the title and song are meant to highlight the impact that losing Dess had on Kris, and how even now, as they have found her, they are still distant and can't be fully together again. And while I'm talking about her room, there's a few other details about it I want to address. First, I want to highlight the wallpaper which depicts the Northern Lights. This feels very important thanks to the few other times the game makes reference to Northern Lights. Namely, that Gerson calls Chapter 3 of Lord of the Hammer the Isles of the Northern Light. And in Chapter 3 there is a song titled Northern Lights that plays in one very specific room on the second board in the Sword Route, telling you to go to the Northern Lights, which is meant to be hinting at the location of the Ice Palace. I'm not sure what to make of this, outside of this being a point that connects Dess to Chapter 3, and then in turn connecting her to Kris as well, as Kris made the Chapter 3 Dark World. Though I do want to theorize a little bit about what the importance of this might actually be. I think the idea behind this has something to do with the Dark Worlds and maybe the fountains. Dark Worlds themselves are dark, but despite this, they are very colorful and vibrant. And the dark fountains look like pillars of black and dark blue, until you walk up close to them and they go RGB gamer laptop mode. To me, this idea feels very similar to how the Northern Lights are, as the Northern Lights are bright, vibrant colors lighting up the dark night sky. The other detail I want to point out about her room is the star details you can find with star stickers on her wall and her bedsheet being covered in them. This is simply another point of connecting Dess to the Knight, since they are the same person. This connection being that the Knight's elemental pair being dark/star, and she has multiple star magic attacks. Stars are also given a lot of importance in the game as well, when you factor in the save points are stars, and that the cool Titan eyes you can see in a ton of places are also star-shaped. So stars as a motif are connected to darkness on multiple points. This makes a lot of sense when you factor in how stars are usually one of the only sources of light to fill up the dark of a night sky, similar to the Northern Lights. So it makes sense that they would be given this level of importance as a visual. There are also other ways you can connect stars with Dess, like how Dess wanted to be a rock star, and that she was a rising star, as Tenna calls her a prodigy, and that when she went missing, she became a falling star. This idea can connect us to a line in Chapter 4. In a secret room connected to the egg rooms, we can find a book that says, "And so wept the fallen star, making rivers with its tears. Then, slowly, from the bitter water, something grew. It looked like glass." I believe this dialogue is likely talking about Dess and what happened to her. It seems to be talking about how she became the Knight, or how the shadow crystals are made. Or both, maybe? It could be both. I feel this is likely to be the shadow crystals, based on how they are glass in the light world, and how Sham talks about them in Chapter 2, saying that Spamton found his shadow crystal inside the Neo suit, and that the suit must have been very important to a Lightner if that was the case. Based on what we know about the Neo suit, one could theorize that the origin point of a shadow crystal, as in how they get made and form and stuff, is when a Lightner has an important dream that they abandon. And if this is true, then maybe Dess's shadow crystal was made when she abandoned her hope of escaping the Dark World, or something like that. But that's just a theory I wanted to share. Now, one last thing I want to mention about Dess's room for now is the huge pile of baseballs you can find in her closet. This shouldn't be surprising, as she was heavily connected to baseball throughout the game, and baseballs are even featured in her Dark Worlds. It's much less weird than her pile of identical red shoes, but I bring this up because I want to discuss a theory I have, which is that Kris and Dess would play baseball together. I think this makes a lot of sense, considering that Dess couldn't play baseball alone, and I think it would make sense for them to play together. Namely, I think Kris was usually the pitcher, and Dess was usually the batter. I think Kris was actually a really good pitcher as well. My evidence for this is the speed and accuracy at which they throw objects at the soul, clearly demonstrating their practice skill. Now, with that being said, what other fun activity could Kris and Dess have theoretically done with each other? How about knife fighting? Yep, that's right, Kris and Dess are knife buddies. Okay, so funny story, before the chapters came out, I had this little theory that Dess was actually the one that gave Kris their knife, and I guess that just ended up being right. But more seriously, both Kris and Dess are very connected to knives. Kris's knife is clearly a huge deal. I don't feel like I have to argue for that point. And as for Dess, well, first off, her boss theme is named after her knife. Also, we can find a different knife of hers in her room, and of course, she uses her knife to make the Dark Fountains. Since Dess is the older one, it's safe to say that she got into knives first, and Kris got into them because of her. As stated a moment ago, I think Kris's knife was most likely a gift from Dess. But it's also possible that Kris got it from somewhere else, and simply got it to try and be more like Dess. Their knives are the things they use to make the fountains, and overall just seem to be one of the most important items in the game, and one of Kris and Dess's major points of connection and mirroring. I will be shocked if we don't learn more about them and why they have them in later chapters. And speaking of that, I feel very confident that Kris will use their knife in the Dark World at some point. It will most likely turn into some super weapon, similar to Dess's black knife. But it's also possible that it could turn into a darkener. I guess we'll just have to wait and see. But speaking of Dess's black knife, let's talk about it. So I feel pretty confident in saying that Dess's weapon is in fact her knife, on account that the game just says it is, in the black shard description, which means it's not her bat, despite the fact that it is shaped like a bat that one time when she first pulls it out. Which is kind of funny when you think about it, because is Dess ever going to use her bat? Because, like, okay, she needs to be using their knife in order to connect her more to Kris, and to make them both use the same type of weapon to make the fountains, and Kris needs to use a knife because Kara, right? But Dess overall, outside of her boss fight, is more associated with bats, which is why Toby even made the knife look like a bat for a second so he would figure out the knight is Dess. Okay, mini bat tangent over, back to the knife. Dess's knife has a lot of special properties. It seems to be able to shapeshift just like how she can, as it seems to take multiple shapes and forms. Unless these knives are meant to be different or Dess herself is turning into them, which is possible. In fact, there's an unused attack where she just turns into one of the knives. I mean, overall, it does seem like the knife is made out of the same stuff that Dess herself is made out of. I mean, she does just pull it out of her handhole. And you just gotta wonder, how did it get like that? I don't know, maybe the same way that Dess turned into the knight. With that thought, I want to bring up another possible way I think Dess could have turned into the knight that I'm a fan of, which is that Dess stabbed herself with her knife in the same way one would make a fountain, basically making a fountain inside herself, which turned her into the knight, and I guess absorbed the knife in the process. Personally, I really like this one. More or less the same idea, just slightly different, but Kris could have been the one to stab her. With this, the voice in the code would have to be a flashback to right after she became the knight, and not right before. Which honestly makes even more sense considering the Chapter 4 unused text. Now, one last point for this theory. You know that eye in the middle of her chest? What if that's not an eye, but actually a stab wound instead? But back to the knife itself. Of the special things about Dess's knife, arguably the most important is that it seems to be the same in both the light and dark worlds. If you beat the knight, you chip the knife and get to use their shard as a weapon for Kris. In Chapter 4, you can take that shard back to the light world and inspect it, showing that it's the same in the light world. With this information, we can assume that Dess is also the same in both the light and dark worlds. And as I've seen people mention it, the black shard is not the same as the shadow crystals. When you crack the sword, the chip that comes off is called a black shard, and is different from the shadow crystal. There just so happens to also be a shadow crystal in the sword somehow, for some reason. Also, it's stated that the shadow crystals are invisible, while we can clearly see the shard. And the black shard stays the same in the light world, while the crystal turns into glass, that seems to have the same powers that the crystals have in the dark world. This means that Dess seems to be made of the same material of the black shard, and not made of the crystals. As if she was made of the shadow crystals, you wouldn't be able to see her at all. Unless what we are seeing is actually just her shadow, which could be the case. But the point being, the crystals and shard are listed as different items with different properties. Though it is weird that there was a shadow crystal inside the knife, right? And with the talk of the shadow crystals and the knight shape-shifting stuff and Dess being the same in the light world, that does bring into question this moment where Kris imagines the knight taking off their helmet. This line is so weird because, like, this stuff is not armor. She turns into a ball sometimes. Even if she can take this off, what would even be underneath? I would guess nothing. But then, what about there being a shadow crystal inside the knife? If the knife is made of the same stuff that the knight's body/armor is, then does Dess also have shadow crystals inside that as well? Is her actual body made up of a shadow crystal core with the black shard stuff being armor around it? Is the armor actually the shadow cast by the shadow crystals made physical somehow? And if this is actually correct, then what does that mean for the other titans and the fountains and darkness in general? Will any of this stuff about the knight and the shadow crystals get explained? I don't know. Probably. I sure hope so. I don't want to get to the end of Chapter 7 and still be wondering why the knight had a shadow crystal in their sword. But now might be a good time to talk about the night fight in greater detail, since it is kind of a big deal. Throughout the fight, we get multiple hints regarding Kris and Dess's relationship and how they are working together. It's very telling and clear that they are both holding back on each other. I mean, Dess is clearly holding back in general, as she is able to rip Tenna's arms off with her bare hands, dealing 5,000 damage, but needs to hit Ralsei at least 3 times to swoon him. She's basically just play fighting the whole boss fight. And this makes sense, as she doesn't actually kill any of them, which on its own confirms that the plan is not in any way to cause the roaring, but to simply set up an adventure for the party to go on, so we can have the souls seal the fountains at the end. But when it comes to Kris specifically, it's very clear that she's holding back extra hard on them, as unlike Ralsei and Susie, Dess will never swoon Kris. And Kris is also holding back as well, as they do notably less damage in the fight. And we know for almost a fact that they are holding back, because when Susie or Ralsei gets swooned, Kris does noticeably more damage. Most people that I've talked to about it seem to think that this is because Kris gets upset about them being swooned, and I would say this is the most likely answer. I do, however, feel like there could be other possible explanations for this, but I honestly can't really think of any that I like enough to put forward as an alternative. But just with that interpretation, this does inform us a good deal about Kris and how they are treating Dess, and in turn, how they feel about her. They don't want to hurt her, but they also don't want Susie and Ralsei to get hurt, and their emotions get the better of them, and they stop holding back. At least, not as much, as they're still clearly holding back, just like they have been the whole game, as they have their own knife that they keep on them at all times, yet they only ever let us use a pencil. Clearly, Kris at any time could just use their knife to get out of most of their problems, but they don't want us to have access to that much power. I do feel confident in saying, though, that at some point, Kris will stop holding back, and will use their knife in the Dark World. But now, what about the axe? When we use the check, it will say that Kris couldn't learn anything about the knight, which could be implying that they already know everything there is to know about them. Which, when considering everything else, seems likely to be correct. When you check again, Kris will point off into the distance, further denying us any information. When you hold your breath twice, Kris will smile. There are a lot of different ways you could read this. It's pretty open-ended. It could be that Kris is nervous, or maybe they actually are happy about the fight, and they're smiling knowing that everything is going exactly as they planned. I'm not 100% sure what to really make of it, to be honest. So let's move on to the end of the fight. After you win the battle, Susie and Ralsei get swooned, and Kris gets knighted. And to me, this is a really powerful image. I mean, think about it for a second. This is the only time we get to see Kris and Dess physically interacting in the present without anyone else looking. This is them when they're not putting on an act. And this one action tells us volumes about their relationship. The imagery of Kris being Dess's loyal squire, being promoted to the rank of knight, invokes the idea of both of them role-playing these roles within their game, and showcases how Dess feels about Kris and vice versa. That she sees Kris as her apprentice, her protege, someone she cares deeply about and wants to see succeed. And that Kris views their relationship in the same way, that they look up to Dess as a teacher, a mentor, someone they strive to be like and learn from, someone they care deeply about and wants to see again. Now, as much as I don't want to ruin the moment by bringing up something kind of annoying, I do feel like I pretty much need to address it, because I'm sure if I don't, I'll get a ton of people asking about it. What do I think of the Kris/ theory? I think it's a fun theory that's cool and neat to think about, and is worth considering. And I also think it's most likely wrong. I am, however, sadly not surprised, but I am disappointed in how hostile and toxic discussion around this theory has become. And I do want to emphasize that this toxicity is almost completely one-sided and comes almost exclusively from detractors from the theory, as I have yet to see even a single person who believes in this theory 100% and thinks it's impossible for Dess to have done the slash. And I just have to sit here and be like, really guys? This is the one you decided to make a stink about? This theory is such small potatoes, it changes almost nothing if it's true or not. There's almost no stakes to the plot. Like, I get it if you don't like it because you think it takes away from Dess's character. That's fair. Her doing the slash is cool and tells us about her character. Namely, it shows us how much of a sore loser she is, and how immature she is, basically raging after losing a game. Which makes sense when you remember that she's actually a 13-year-old spoiled rich girl who's been trapped in the Shadow Realm for 6 years and given super darkness powers. But at the same time, when I consider Kris slash, I also think it would be cool and tell us about Kris. It theoretically shows us how much they are holding back, and how committed they are to Dess. But really, to be honest, I don't think we really need Kris slash to tell us that. Those things are true and clearly evident, even if they just stood there and let Dess slash them. For me, the thing I like most about Kris slash is that I feel like the Kris knighting scene makes more sense with it. Because it's basically Dess going, "Kris, was that a roaring knight slash horizontal just now? Now I must give you an promotion." Okay, but jokes aside, I do think it makes more sense for Dess to be knighting Kris for slashing them, as opposed to knighting them because the player kicked her butt. Which, to be honest, I do find a little weird, but like, it's not that big of a deal. Honestly though, I think the only really big impact and difference that Kris slash actually makes is on Ralsei. So let's go over how Ralsei factors into this, right? Because what happens is Susie gets swooned, and then Ralsei looks right at Kris and says, "How could you?" And then he gets swooned. Which you could argue is Ralsei reacting to Kris slashing Susie, because it wouldn't make sense for Ralsei to say, "How could you?" to the knight. On the count that she has been attacking them for the last 5 minutes. Like, what do you mean, how could you? They've been trying to swoon you the whole time. Why are you shocked they did it now? Of course, the big problem with this is that afterwards, Ralsei never brings this up again. It says that Kris fought bravely, and he thought they could have won just there. And keep in mind, when I say he's looking at Kris, he can't just be looking at Susie. And also, while I do think it's weird for him to be saying, "How could you?" towards the knight, it's also just a common phrase for something like this. So it's not really a big deal at all. But okay, here's the thing. Because Ralsei never brings it up, in order for Kris slash to be real, then it means that Ralsei would have to be in on the knight conspiracy. And this to me is like the one really big change and thing that matters if Kris slash was true. Which again, I don't think it is. I just wanted to actually talk about it in good faith, because it's actually a fun theory to talk about when you don't start insulting each other over it. But here's the other big thing. Even this doesn't actually matter that much, because Dess could have slashed them, and Ralsei could still be 100% in on the conspiracy. It's just that under Knight Slash, Ralsei doesn't have to be in on it. But since I brought it up, that was a great time to ask the question, is Ralsei in on the Knight conspiracy? The answer is actually yes. Though he might not be aware that he is. So to try and keep things as simple as possible, there are basically 3 different ways to explain Ralsei. So, option 1, Kris and Dess made Ralsei and his dark world. Ralsei knows about this and what they want him to do, and everything that might contradict this idea is Ralsei just acting and or lying. Option 2, Kris and Dess made Ralsei and his dark world, but he doesn't know that they did. He knows his role and what he's supposed to do, but he doesn't know who made him and why, basically making him a sleeper agent working for them without him even knowing. And the third option is that Kris and Dess did not make Ralsei. Someone else did, and by someone else I mean Gaster. However, Kris and Dess are aware of Ralsei and what he will do, and are planning around him. So even if they didn't make him, he is still being factored into the whole Knight conspiracy. Now, to be honest, I really hate option 3, and I don't think it's correct. So let's start with all the reasons why I think Kris and Dess made Ralsei. To start off, the Castletown fountain is right next door to the first Dark World made by the Knight. It is basically impossible for the Knight to have made that Dark World and not be 100% aware of Castletown. On top of this, in order for Kris to get to that fountain to seal it, they have to first go through the Closet Dark World, which is clearly all part of the plan. Ralsei is constantly telling us to go seal the fountains, which is clearly what Kris and Dess wants us to do. After we seal the fountains, Ralsei tells us to grab all the Darkners and bring them back to Castletown, making it work as a base to store the Darkners that Kris and the Knight make. Clearly, this must also be part of the plan. We also can't forget about all the special knowledge that Ralsei has, not just that he knows the whole prophecy, but that he also knows about game mechanics, specifically how the soul works and that Kris is being controlled by it. He even names the town after us. And the only possible way to explain this is if him and Castletown were made by someone that would know this information. The only people that would know these things would be Gaster and the second voice, which we know as Kris and/or Dess. And here's the thing, because of the fact that the second voice scene exists at all, means that Ralsei has to have been made by the second voice. Because Ralsei knows both Kris and Susie's names before they even meet, which wouldn't make sense if it was made by Gaster, because Gaster expects us to be playing as the vessel. So if Ralsei was made by Gaster, he should be confused why Kris shows up instead of the vessel. The only way for Gaster to have made Ralsei and have this make sense is if there was no second voice and was just Gaster the whole time, or if Gaster is playing 4D chess and expected Kris and Dess to take the soul, which is actually what he wanted the whole time. But like, at that point, what was even the point of writing the vessel and second voice stuff into the plot? And on top of that, it just makes way more sense if it was Kris or Dess, because Ralsei is clearly connected to Kris and the Dreamers. I still 100% believe that Ralsei is the Red Horn Headband, and that he's meant to be more or less Kris's old persona, and it just makes zero sense to me that Gaster would make Ralsei if this is the case, which I'm certain it is. With the new info that all the Darkners are meant to be based on a game Kris and Dess used to play, Ralsei feels like he fits right in with the rest of them as another character they would have created. Now that just leaves us with the point of, does Ralsei know that he's working for Kris and Dess? And here we got a bit of a problem, because I kind of feel like Toby has written himself into a bit of a corner with Ralsei here, where there is just no satisfying answer to this question. Because if he doesn't know, then I have to ask the question, how? He already has all this knowledge about stuff, says he knows everything that is supposed to happen, and he keeps having private conversations with Kris about something. The only other person we know Kris is having private conversations with is the Knight. But then, if he does know everything that's going on, that Kris and the Knight are working together, and that he is also working with them, that means in scenes like this one, he would have to be acting. And like, we already had the breakdown scene where Susie calls him out for withholding information and he admits that he knows everything. And then what? He just keeps lying? Keeps withholding information? I mean, actually, that is pretty much just what happens. He just convinces Susie she doesn't actually want to know what's going to happen. But like, I don't know, it all just seems unsatisfying to me. If he has just been lying and acting this whole time, even after getting called out for it, that would be weird to me. But also, if he just has this one specific gap in his knowledge for some reason, I also think that's weird. And I guess that's better, because then it can be used as a big reveal for him later, right? At some point we will learn that Kris and Dess made him, and the drama that will stem from that would probably be better than if, after Kris reveals they have been working with the Knight the whole time, to Susie, Ralsei also steps up and goes, "Yeah, I was in on it too. We have both just been lying to you, Susie, and tricking you the whole time." But with that being said, I honestly feel like I would still prefer if Ralsei knew about the night plan and was in on it. I do feel like it can at least give us an answer to what he and Kris are talking about and why he wants to change the prophecy, and the ways he is trying to go about doing so. He wants everyone to have a happy ending, and thinks being nice to everyone can change the prophecy. So in these scenes, he could be explaining his plan and what he wants to do to Kris. With the plan basically being, if we get the player to be really nice, then maybe the bad parts of the prophecy don't have to happen, and we can do the night plan without anything bad happening, and everyone can be happy. Basically, he's still loyal to Kris in the night, but he is trying his best in his own way to make the best outcome for everyone. To be honest, I am a little worried about what we are going to end up doing with Ralsei's character. And I'm also not sure what I want to see out of him at this point. But also, I feel like it not being one of these two somehow would be even worse. Like, way worse. But oh well, I can only talk about Ralsei for so long in this video, so let's just get back to Kris and Dess. So now I think it's a good time to really discuss one of the bigger things we know Kris and Dess did together. That being Dess showing Kris music videos. Tenno tells us about this right before you play Raise Up Your Bat. Specifically, he says, "Oh, Kris, remember December? Oh, that little musical prodigy. Remember when she'd grab the remote and swap it from cartoons to that wild music video channel Toriel forbid you to see? Guess your mother never been a fan of alligators in bikinis. Dess rocking her guitar and singing along to those nasty, nasty songs. Didn't you all think she was just so cool? Heck, maybe you can make her come back and watch again sometime. Haha, just kidding. Anyway, are you ready to rock?" There's a lot you can take and read into this dialogue. It's actually the most direct the game ever really talks about Dess, and is the only time we're told directly about something Dess and Kris did together, and the scene is unskippable. So clearly this dialogue is very important in regards to how the game wants us to view Kris and Dess's relationship. And so what does it tell us? It confirms to us that Kris and Dess would play together, just the two of them, which is more evidence that the girl Ram mentions is Dess. It also tells us that Kris thought Dess was really cool and looked up to her, and wanted to be like her. Dess showing Kris inappropriate content also portrays Dess as a bad influence on Kris, something that Toriel seems to believe, as later in the chapter we can find a parental lock blocking the music video channel with the passcode for it being 1225. 1225 of course being Christmas Day, aka December holiday, implying that Dess showing Kris inappropriate content was something Toriel considered to be so bad that he decided to put parental controls on the TV and make the code for it basically December's name as a passcode. It basically doubles down on what Tenno told us earlier, drawing more towards this piece of information being important. And for me, it confirms that Toriel felt Dess was a bad influence on Kris, which could maybe explain why interacting with Toriel after you win the night fight has it say it looks like she's having a nightmare, specifically that it's a reaction to Kris being knighted. The Tenno dialogue also highlights the idea that Dess was a bit of a rule breaker and would drag Kris into this trouble as well. You also know that Kris was a big prankster and would get themselves into trouble a lot. Between this dialogue and the other things we know about Kris and Dess, it seems like they were seen as the problem children, while Azrael and Noelle was seen as the golden children. As such, this was something Kris and Dess likely bonded over, portraying the idea that one of the reasons why they would spend time together is that they were the only ones that actually shared the same interests, and had compatible personalities. That Noelle and Azrael wouldn't find these types of activities fun, so Kris and Dess would have to do them with just each other. Now I want to head back to Dess's room to take a closer look at some of Dess's instruments, and what they might say about her. Let's take a look at this line of dialogue specifically. A violin, a flute, a microphone. They all look very expensive, and very dented. This dialogue intrigues me, and I think there's quite a bit you can read into it. The use of the word dented tells me a lot. None of these instruments should be getting dented from regular use, So that means Dess would have to be doing something to them that would cause them to get dented. So what do I think she did to them? Well, I think that when she tried to play these instruments, when she didn't get it right away, like she did with other things, she would get frustrated and then smash them against things like the floor or wall or whatever. You get the idea. And a big reason why I believe this is what happened is we have another confirmed instance of Dess's first response to something upsetting her is to hit it. That being when she would hit Kris with her wiffle bat whenever they teased Noelle. Said wiffle bat is directly above these instruments and is extremely dented to the point that it's now shaped, well, like that. And the dialogue remarks about how looking at these things makes your head hurt. The overall conclusion I have come to based on these things is that Dess had violent tendencies. That her first response to anything upsetting her was to get violent and hit the thing upsetting her. I mean, she could be smashing her instruments because she's trying to be a rock star, but while that's a reasonable idea, it's also, in my opinion, a less interesting reading. And no matter what you think of the instruments, you can't ignore her hitting Kris. And how this violence would have affected Kris, I think is pretty important. Personally, I think Kris didn't actually mind being hit by Dess. Honestly, I think one of the main reasons why they would tease Noelle is because they knew it would get Dess's attention. That this, in a way, informed how Kris felt about getting hurt. That they started to associate feeling pain with Dess, which might not be the greatest thing when, more generally, Kris looks at Dess as this cool, older role model that they want to be like, who they have a meaningful connection with, and just generally love and care about. I think it's very safe to say that Kris self-harms. Between the bloodstain in their room to the fact that they carry a knife on them at all times, to the line from Toriel saying that Kris does this sometimes in response to Kris staying in the bathroom for long periods of time while leaving the water running. And also all the stuff with the soul, which is also supposed to be viewed as a form of self-harm. And it's clear that there's more than one reason why Kris is doing this, but I think it's mostly two main reasons. Their overall body dysphoria and Dess. Both from the trauma of losing her and how the pain reminds them of her. You might think that sounds crazy, and maybe it is, but I'm confident that even if my analysis isn't perfect or 100% accurate, that Dess repeatedly hitting Kris and Kris still being her friend and looking up to her despite how she would treat them sometimes is going to be extremely important to understanding their relationship and the story of this game. And I feel this way because Dess right now is still actively hurting Kris as a core part of their plan together, that Kris not only agreed to, but is more likely to be the one that came up with most of the plan anyway. Of course, this is also still ignoring a big aspect to this, which is that Dess was hitting Kris to protect Noelle from them, which highlights both Dess's capacity to harm others while desiring to protect her loved ones. So I know she desires to protect and care for Noelle, which is very important, but then you have to ask if that desire to protect also applies to Kris. And I would imagine that it does, that when push comes to shove, Dess wants to protect Kris. As previously stated, while Dess does attack Kris in the battle, and throughout Chapter 4, she is noticeably holding back with Kris specifically, as she never swoons them. And ultimately, while I do think it's possible, maybe even likely, that Dess will end up seriously hurting Kris at some point, I think if that happens, it'll be treated as an Ivan the Terrible moment, where she will be filled with immediate regret and anguish. Dess's capacity to both love and hurt others, and her lack of emotional control, with how her first response to something upsetting her is to go straight to violence, is something that's deeply important to her relationship with Kris. It's even in her song, "Raise up your bat for the burning fight, let's knock 'em dead into the night." But there's another important emotion tied to the night and Dess, and that is fear. There has been some talk about how the night is connected to the idea of fear, and that is for good reason. Just on a surface level, the night is clearly connected to the Titans, who Ralsei describes as the fear of the dark made manifest. The idea of fear being relevant to the night is pretty evident, but what about Dess before she became the night? What was she afraid of? Well, to me, it seems like she was afraid of a lot of things. Let's start with her bed. Don't you think it's weird that it's facing away from the closet and towards the wall? Almost like she's afraid of what might be lurking inside her closet. So she turns herself away from the closet to not look at it. Out of sight, out of mind. There is of course more. Both the game and Spamton sweepstakes talk about the idea of an icy cryptid. And while in the game we hear about Dess hitting Kris for telling Noelle that it's real and eats kids, based on the stories we see in the Spamton sweepstakes, about her taking the IC box and burning its eyes out, leads me to believe that she was a believer. I mean, the page literally says that Dess believes her about it, so yeah. The more interesting point is that it says there are more icy sightings from Dess. When we try to click on the link, it of course says the page cannot be found. Combine this with her survival gear, namely her walkie-talkies, binoculars, multi-tool knives, rations, and camo jacket, which I think she was probably using while going cryptid hunting, and you can see the picture of someone that was at least a little paranoid. Which can make a lot of sense when you factor in her religion into this and how it has a prophesized apocalyptic event in it. Basically, she was either a doomsday prepper or a cryptid hunter, but probably both. Which then brings us back to the unused dialogue that could be found in the code. As I have stated before, this is clearly meant to be Dess in the past when she first got trapped in the Dark World. And what she says here also highlights her fears of being alone, lost in the dark. That what's happening to her is exactly like a nightmare she always had. Walking into a room of pure darkness, with only the light shining in from the door, only to have it shut on you, leaving you trapped in the dark. Ultimately, when she became the night, she seemed to become a manifestation of all of her fears. A creature of darkness that is destined to bring an endless nightmare to all while trapped within her own nightmare. She was afraid of the boogeyman in the closet, and now she has become the boogeyman in the closet. And with that, I must now address the elephant in the room. Closet Night is real. With an asterisk. I hold strong that while the thumbnail might be wrong, the title is still true. I believe that the Night has the ability to teleport in and out of closets, or she's using the closets as portal doors, just like how the fast travel doors in the Dark Worlds work. Or there's secret tunnels that connect the closets to the shelter. This is how they are getting around town without being seen, and this is also why all the locations where they make dark fountains have closets in them. This is also the reason why Kris needed to make the Chapter 3 fountain, because there is no large closets in Kris's house for Dess to teleport into. The fact that the closets keep showing up, and the one time they're not there is the one time we can confirm that Kris made the fountain instead, means that they seem to be needed in order for Dess to safely make a fountain. And the main reason why I believe this to be the case, that it's some kind of teleportation instead of her simply hiding, besides all the points I've made for why that doesn't make sense in my Closet Night video, is that I don't believe she would be able to escape the computer lab after making the fountain without teleporting. It just doesn't make sense that she would be able to make the fountain while Noelle and Burley were in the room and then manage to run from the library to the shelter without anyone seeing her, especially since Undyne was standing right outside directing traffic. On top of that, I also believe that the Night most likely works off vampire logic, in the sense that direct sunlight would probably kill her, meaning that she can only be outside at night or when it's raining. Because 1, to me that just makes sense, and 2, if she could just exist in the light world in the middle of the day with no issues, then it makes less sense why they are doing the night plan. Because if the problem is that she's just tall and scary now, that really shouldn't be a huge problem. Everyone in town is a monster that looks different. Her looking like this shouldn't be that big of a deal if that was the only issue. And another thing pointing towards this being some kind of fast travel doorway and not that the knight is just hiding is the scrapped anime intro, which says the knight would be standing in a doorway, which is another thing connecting the idea that the closets are important and magical in some way. And let's not forget all the Gaster stuff and how he's also connected to special doors and teleporting, and as already mentioned, there are similar doors in the Dark Worlds that let you teleport between them. And another big reason why I believe this is the case is because there is even more evidence with the new chapters that Noelle wasn't in the room when the fountain was made. When Susie makes her fountain in Chapter 4, Kris and Susie stand next to the fountain. When they appear in the Dark World, they are standing next to the fountain in the Dark World. And in Chapter 3, they enter sleeping on the couch. And they start the Dark World sleeping on the couch in the Dark World. In Chapter 2, we find Noelle right next to the main entrance of the Dark World, where Kris and Susie enter it from. If they had already been in the room when the fountain was made, they would have been placed somewhere closer to the fountain. Because we know that the fountain was made right behind the table, as the laptop recorded the fountain being made. The only way Noelle should have been in the place we found her is if she entered the Dark World the same way Susie and Kris did, which is by walking into the room from the door. So yes, how I think the Chapter 2 fountain was made was that Dess teleported into the room using the closet, turned on the computers, and then made the fountain. And then teleported back to the shelter. And she did all of this before Noelle and Berdly got there. And in Chapter 4, Kris knows that Dess is like in the process of teleporting or something like that, and that's why they don't open the door and stuff. And honestly, I still don't really like this, even if I think this explanation is much better than her just hiding in the closet for hours, waiting for Noelle to show up so she can knock her unconscious with her bat. And the annoying part about all of this is that Toby didn't need to write it like this at all. He could have just written it so that she sneaks around at night when no one is looking and makes the fountains then. Just like how Kris would have been making the fountains if they were the only knight in the story. But he didn't. And like, I get why. I understand why he decided to write it like this. He got the idea of Dess being afraid of the boogeyman in the closet, and then ending up turning into the boogeyman in the closet, and thought it was a really cool idea. He was probably rewatching Monsters Inc., and then a light bulb appeared over his head, and he was like, that's it! That's how I have the knight travel around town without anyone seeing them. I get it. It makes enough sense. It works with the themes of the game and the character. But it has caused me unneeded stress, and I wish he just went with the holiday ninja style route. Or just have Kris open the first 3 fountains for her. It would make no real difference anyway. But also, all of this is another big reason why I'm so confident that Dess made the Castletown fountain, because how could she have made the Chapter 1 fountain without teleporting into the closet first? Plus it plays the knight's motif when you walk into the closet for the first time. So yeah, another big point towards Ralsei being made by Kris and Dess. Okay, but enough of that, let's talk about something more fun. So here's a weird one. Clover is Dess. Okay, so you all remember Clover from Chapter 1, right? The 3-headed Darkner. Well, as it turns out, she seems to be giving us a little glimpse into Dess and what she was like. By sparing her, or just talking to this one NPC that explains how to spare her, we learn that Clover only has 3 interests, which are sports, trees, and cute boys. Which just so happens to line up with 3 of the 4 things we know Dess was into. As that we see that she played a lot of sports, played in the woods, and probably had a crush on Azrael, considering she kept stealing his stuff, like his shirt and retainer. So with this info, is there anything else about Dess that Clover might be teasing? Well, Clover has 3 heads, each of which is technically a different person, and 2 of these heads are straight, while the 3rd one is gay. And so what does this mean for Dess? Well, it means that we can say with confidence that Dess is bisexual with a straight lean. Was this the dumbest way I could have reached this conclusion? Yeah, probably. But to get a bit more serious regarding the topic of Dess's potential queerness, You know how Kris is non-binary and is implied to have body dysphoria based on how they used to wear the red horn headband, or they just generally don't seem to like being a human. Well, what about Dess? Now, to be honest, this is a bit more fanfiction than theory or analysis. But what if Dess also had body dysphoria? The overall evidence for this isn't a lot, but I don't know, I can't be the only one to think it's weird that Dess just has dozens of shoes in her closet even though she's a monster that normally doesn't wear any. We can find one pair that says it's custom made for hooves, but it's not clear if the shoes in the closet are also like this, or if these are just normal shoes she tried to wear, but they just never fit. But I do feel like the fact that she tried so hard to wear shoes shows the idea that she might not have been super happy with the shape of her, well, not feet. And on the point of gender, she was clearly gender nonconforming in a similar vein to Susie. And we see that the knight so far has only been referred to with they-it pronouns. This might not mean anything, but I personally wouldn't be surprised if Dess wasn't 100% happy with her gender and body. And if this is correct, then I think this could be another thing that Kris and Dess bonded over. Dess wanting to be more human, and Kris wanting to be more monster. Another potential point of evidence for this, we can find a bunch of human soul-shaped pillows in her closet that we know Carol collects a bunch of. Maybe Carol gave these to Dess to try and support her desire to be a human without really understanding how to. Kinda like how Toriel got Kris the horned headband. I mean, it's either that or Carol is collecting heart pillows for a different reason, and the reason they're in Dess's closet is because she took them from Kris after they teased Noelle, putting them in the closet so Kris couldn't get them, and then forgetting about them. Which is honestly just as likely, if not more so. And I did say this was more of a fanfic than theory. While I am writing about this in my theory video, I also happen to have written a little comic about this very topic, which was then illustrated by my friend DeltaNDestiny. And you should totally read it. There's a link to it in the description. And you should also totally check out Delta's channel because they also make Deltarune theories and animations, and they're really good. Now I want to talk about the egg rooms. I want to start with the Chapter 4 egg room, as it's the one that gives us the clearest picture of what they seem to be about. Now, instead of explaining the room point by point, to save myself some time, I'm just going to assume you already know what happens. The whole room seems to be an abstract memory of a time in which Kris was taken to therapy for what we can only assume was the shelter incident, making the egg rooms seem even more important to understanding the story than one would have been led to believe before, as the first two were just weird small rooms without collision, with just a man behind a tree and nothing else. But of course, this connects into itself, with the egg rooms now giving us another point of reference to what happened to Kris and Dess and how it affected Kris, the Chapter 3 Eggman having more dialogue claiming that he is forgotten, and he will be forgotten again. This could connect to the idea that after encountering Gaster or Friend, or whatever exactly happened to Kris and Dess, they both forgot a lot of the details of what happened to them, even though they also seem to have gained great deals of knowledge about how their world works and the prophecy. To add evidence to this point, I want to bring back the unused text once again, which as mentioned earlier, is Dess in the past from when she first got lost in the dark. And one of the first things she says is that she doesn't know how she got here. She just got trapped and she has already forgotten what just happened to her, while still clearly remembering things from before this event. Of course, all of this to say the same thing I said at the start of the video, that Gaster pilled Kris and Dess when they first fell into the shelter, which probably happened shortly after Entry 17, and that the egg rooms are meant to be connected to this event and trauma that it left Kris with. Now let's talk about the Roots prophecy, which can be found in the room that you need to go between to get to the egg room. The panel depicts a house between two trees, with the word Roots above it. I think this is meant to have multiple meanings. I think it's meant to be both talking about your roots, as in your childhood home, and also the roots of a tree, as seen with the trees. I also feel like it's likely meant to connect with the terms the root cause or root of the issue, as in the inciting incident. And I bring this up mainly for one very important reason. There are 2 songs in the OST with the word root in their title, those being Digital Roots, which plays in the basement of Queen's Mansion in Chapter 2, which is an area that can only be accessed by doing the Spamton Neo quest. And it's also the first location in the game that Friend can appear in. The other song is Bit Roots, which plays in the Sword route of Chapter 3 and is the theme that plays on the path to the shelter. Friend also appears in this area as an enemy in the ERAM boss fight. One more important thing to note about all of this is that the NPC next to the Roots panel will say a jumbled up message. How it's jumbled up is random, however thanks to the Spamton sweepstakes, we know that it's supposed to say, "Lost where the forest would grow, the children followed the pointed tail." Lost where the forest would grow, in my opinion, is clearly referring to the shelter, which is located in a clearing in the middle of the forest. The children following the pointed tail is referring to what happened to Kris and Dess. They went into the shelter, got lost, and then found Friend's tail, which they then followed until it led them to Friend or Gaster. With all of this laid out, I feel like I can say with some amount of confidence that the areas that play the Roots themes are meant to be connected to Kris and Dess's trauma for the shelter incident. And that's what the word root is meant to be connecting to, the root of all of Kris's problems. Now there are a few more things I feel are worth mentioning about this topic. The first being the idea that the Roots phrasing might also be meant to connect to the Bible verse, "The love of money is the root of all kinds of evil," which can easily connect to Spamton, and also might end up being relevant to Friend. The other one is where this is all inspired from. You see, within the first hours of Breath of Fire 2, there is a scene that is basically exactly what I'm assuming happened in the shelter incident, based on the hints I just laid out. Now this isn't really a spoiler for Breath of Fire 2, this happens in the first hour, very early in the game. So don't worry about being spoiled. So what happens in the game is 2 kids, one of which is the main character, get caught in a rainstorm. They enter a dark cave to escape the rain, and there they find a pointed tail with segmented parts that looks exactly like the Tale of Hell prophecy panel. They follow the tail further into the dark cave only to find a demon on the other end of it. The demon then attacks the kids. The demon character is very plot relevant, however in order to really explain more I would need to explain the plot of Breath of Fire 2, and I just don't have time for that in this video, but I think you get the point. If you want to learn more about this, I trust you can look into it yourself. The game is on Nintendo Switch Online, so if you have that, you can easily play the game on there if you want. I think that's about it for the Roots. And since I did mention it a moment ago, why not go a bit further and actually talk about the Sword route itself. Now there is a lot to discuss about this topic, and I won't be going into everything. Instead we're simply going to skip right to the part that is relevant to Kris and Dess. So on the final part of the Sword route, at some point you will enter this room. Inside you will find a pitch black enemy. It's hard to see if it wasn't for its blue eyes. The interesting thing about this enemy is that it will mimic your inputs. The goal of the puzzle is to have both Kris and the enemy stand on switches. However, something weird happens when you do so. You lose control of Kris, but keep control of the enemy. The missing blocks get filled, and the door gets locked. In order to leave the room, you must walk the enemy into Kris, in which they will then automatically kill the enemy. Now some of you might be wondering why I believe this part specifically is about Kris and Dess, and well, we actually have some pretty solid evidence that this is 100% meant to be Dess. See, this specific enemy actually has 2 sprites in the code assigned to it, the second sprite being the sprite of a black deer. In fact, you can change the enemy to this sprite by simply changing a single variable. So that confirms that this enemy is supposed to be the knight. Not to mention, the normal sprite already looks like the knight to begin with. And man is this room ominous. Like, I'm gonna be so real right now, this room scares me. You see, a lot of the Sword route is about showing off and teasing what will happen in the Rear route. The second part highlighting what we do in Chapter 2. So this room is very likely teasing what will happen later in the game, most likely on the Rear route specifically. but it's not impossible that whatever this is teasing will also happen in the normal route as well. But there is a lot of different ways you can read this room. Maybe it means that Dess will become a party member in Chapter 6 or something, and then Kris will kill Dess under weird circumstances. Like we force it to happen out of both of their controls. Or Dess sacrifices herself for Kris, but also this sacrifice requires Kris to be the one to kill her. Or maybe Kris is simply putting her down and this was always part of the plan. Maybe we'll be able to play as Dess at some point, or maybe the copying of the controls is just meant to highlight the idea that Kris and Dess would copy each other, or at least that Kris would copy her. I don't know. All I know is that I think whatever this is teasing will likely happen in Chapter 6. For me personally, I hope that what this is teasing is Dess being a party member in Chapter 6 on both routes, and that the part where Kris kills Dess is something that only happens on the weird route. I think that would make sense. Now I want to talk a bit more about how the route characterizes Kris. As the sword route highlights the darker aspects of Kris's character, how a part of them has been enjoying the violence, and even the weird route. That without play, the knife grows dull. Not only is this alone an interesting insight into Kris's character, I also see this as another thing connecting Kris and Dess together. I've already mentioned earlier about Dess's violent tendencies, and her overall enjoyment of violence in general. With this implication, that Kris also on some level enjoys this, is just another point to highlight how the two of them are similar and connected, and is another reason why they would be so close with each other. I would be remiss not to mention how many times in the game that Dess gets directly connected to the number 1225, which is of course meant to be the date of Christmas. The number comes up a bunch of times in multiple important moments. Most importantly, to the plot, it's one of the codes to the shelter. Which I just gotta mention this, cause it's so funny. You know, Kris, if you want to stop us from getting the code, maybe don't let us read the first 3 digits in a 4-digit code. At that point, there's no reason to stop us. There's only 10 numbers it could be at that point. Even if we couldn't figure out that the final digit is 5, we could just brute force it at that point. So good job, Kris. You did nothing. But it does just show up in a bunch of different spots, like how Noelle's watch is stuck at that time, or how Toriel made that the parental control code for the TV, specifically for the music video channel as I talked about earlier. And there is one other use for it in Chapter 3 that is much more mysterious and foreboding. If you enter 1225 into the gacha machine, this will happen. Entering the gumball machine will take you to a mysterious area where Lost Girl is playing. It's a seemingly endless maze that doesn't actually have any collision, so it's not really a maze at all. Eventually, you'll find a second tiny gacha machine. Using it, you will get a small dark triangle. But when you try to take it, it slips through your hand. And then, you can't find it anymore. You couldn't find your hand. Now, as for what the dark triangle could be, it could maybe be a guitar pick, and it is likely connected to the shadow crystals. But whatever it is, it's definitely connected to Dess. And that just leaves us with the more concerning part. This is of course not the only thing in the game pointing to the idea that Kris will lose a hand. In fact, it's actually the most secret hint at it, as the other hints are using the shadow crystal in the light world while alone, as it says that you saw through your hand. And at this point, I feel it's pretty safe to say that the shadow crystals are simply showing you the future. And the other big hint being when Noelle and Susie talk about a character in Dragon Blazers that loses a hand. This of course all leads us to the clear conclusion that Kris will somehow lose a hand. And now the big question is not if Kris will lose a hand, but how. And it really does feel like the most likely answer to how is that Dess will chop it off. I feel this way both because of the 1225 point I started this with, and the fact that Dess ripped Tenna's arms off for betraying her. Even though she actually knew that was going to happen and was part of the plan because she actually needed an excuse to kill him because she had to, because it's in the prophecy. But just because Dess is the most likely doesn't mean it's the only option. There's a lot of things that could take Kris's hand. And I also feel like it's important to propose the idea that this might only happen in the weird route. I also want to share a more unique idea that Kris actually lost their hand a long time ago in the bunker incident, and Gaster made them a vessel hand or something dumb like that, and he's gonna take the hand back later. But something like that feels a lot less likely. I do want to talk a little about the importance of Kris losing a hand and why this might have been written in. Overall, the game has a lot of importance on hands as a means of creating. This is also just true in general. Use your hands to write, play music, play games, and also make them. And I can't help but think about Toby's own wrist issues and how they might have impacted this decision to have Kris lose a hand. Kris losing their hand is likely what will end up being the main bad thing that will happen to them, which to me takes something like, say, Kris dying off the table. There's no reason to kill Kris off at the end of the game, right after taking their hand first. There's also a couple of times the knight is also connected to hands, like when Jevil talks about the shadow of the knight's hand, and when Queen talks about the long hand of the knight. But there is one instance that I feel is important to mention. So after Susie sees the final prophecy, you can go back to the start of the room. It won't let you leave, but if you interact with the exit, it will say, "It seems the way is blocked." You put out your hand, and just out of view, just perfectly out of view, another hand pressed against yours, and pushed you back. We know that this person is Dess because no one else could or would have reasonably done this. And we also know that in the code, during this scene, it plays a guitar sound effect, but you can't hear it because the volume of the effect is set to 0. This hidden interaction is interesting. The thought of Kris reaching out their hand, and then it being met with Dess's hand, with Dess herself just being out of sight, only for her to push Kris back, to nudge them to keep going forward, and finish the mission. And to me, this is another small interaction that highlights their dynamic. Them reaching out for each other and touching hands is an intimate interaction between the two of them. And then Dess pushing Kris to keep going with the night plan, knowing that they can't go back. I don't really have too much more to say about this, but I just had to mention it in the video. And with that, I think we're close to the end. So to wrap this up, I want to talk about what I think is going to happen with Kris and Dess and the night stuff in the upcoming chapters. And the answer is, frankly, I don't know. I'm not Toby. But you already knew that. So instead of trying to nail down one specific prediction, I'm just gonna cover a couple of different ideas and tell you how I feel about them. And these are just my opinions on what I want to see out of the game, not necessarily what I think will happen. So let's start with what is probably the biggest one. Will Kris betray Dess? Personally, I don't think they will. And not only do I think Kris will not betray Dess, that is what I want to happen. I want Kris to stay loyal to Dess. I hope that in the moment of truth, right when it looks like Kris will betray Dess and help Susie, they stab Susie in the back. Honestly, there are so many different ways the night plot could play out, and Kris betraying Dess is the one option I really don't want to see happen. I honestly really feel like Kris and Dess's relationship and their bond together, and the promise they made to each other is so important in the heart of the story that if they were to go back on that promise, I really think that it would ruin the whole story for me. To find out that the credits theme was about this promise in the hearts between Kris and Dess, and then have that end with one of them abandoning that promise, I would hate it. And I feel the same about ideas that Kris is being blackmailed or forced to work with the Knight. I think it's super lame and takes all of the drama out of the story. At most, I'm willing to accept that Kris is being somewhat guilt-tripped into doing this, but only somewhat. I personally, truly believe that Kris is doing all of this because they want to. Because they want Dess back in their life. And that this motivation is a mostly selfish one. That They are not trying to save Dess just to save her, or for Noelle's sake, or anyone else's besides themselves. The reason why they are doing the night plan is because they want Dess, and this is what they are willing to do in order to get her. And honestly, I hope they win. I want Kris and Dess to win. I am 100% on Team Night. I don't care if we have to kill Undyne. I've killed Undyne before. I'll do it again! But I know that's not going to happen. I'll be shocked if Undyne is actually dead by the end of the game, and while I'll be less surprised if Kris manages to save Dess, I would still be surprised. But also, honestly, the whole police sacrifice next week stuff is just so weird to me. I really don't know what to make of it. Like, I don't know, it just feels like a misdirection. And even if it's not, I don't think they're gonna actually kill Undyne. Even if they try, Susie would probably stop them. And after thinking it over for these past few months, what I think is going to happen is that while Kris and Dess's plan A is to use the soul's light to banish the knight's body, so Kris can take Dess's soul and put it in a new vessel body that they make by throwing Undyne into Gaster's meat factory, I think this plan will fail, and they will resort to plan B, which is to have Kris absorb Dess's soul so that she'll always be with them in the dark. And I guess that, at least for right now, is what I think is most likely to happen. But at the same time, if their plan A doesn't work, what is that meant to mean about the prophecy and changing fate? Because they're clearly following the prophecy, so surely the prophecy says they win, right? And that's why they're even enacting it in the first place. I mean, why even bother doing it if it doesn't prophesize their victories? But I don't know. This game can be pretty confusing sometimes. And to be completely honest, I'm not 100% sure what I really want to see happen with Dess or just the rest of the game in general. A part of me just wants everyone to get a happy ending, but I know that's not going to happen. You can probably already tell based on what I've been saying, but I am not confident that I'm going to be happy with how this game turns out. And there are definitely some things that could happen that would honestly probably ruin the game for me. You know, it's been 7 years since Chapter 1 came out. I've been waiting a long time for this game, and I know that it will probably be at least 3 more years before Chapter 7 comes out. I care about this game a lot. Maybe too much. It's kind of built up so much that no matter what happens, I don't think I'm going to be satisfied even if all of my favorite theories from here on out are right. And maybe that's okay. I've seen other people who didn't like the new chapters for, different reasons. Maybe their theories didn't come true. Maybe they didn't like the gameplay or something. Maybe they didn't even dislike it, really. They just felt like something was off, and they didn't enjoy it like they thought they would, or as much as the last 2 chapters. And honestly, I don't really blame them if they don't like it anymore, for whatever reason. I don't think they're wrong for feeling that way. And I mean, let's be real here, it's not a big deal anyway. It's just a game. And as for me, there was stuff in the newest chapters that I didn't really like. Though that's mostly just that. I think the Zelda boards, especially the first one, were just not good. Which isn't really a hot take. I feel like I've seen a lot of people say they didn't like them. And like my only other big one is that I didn't like that Caddy and Chocotin didn't get to do anything. But like, if they show up in Chapter 5, then it's not a big deal. That being said, if they're not in Chapter 5, I will be very disappointed. And I also feel like that's also not a hot take. And really, even still, most of my other complaints mostly stem from me feeling like the game has to be perfect. And anything that I feel isn't perfect is a way bigger deal than it actually is. And despite what some people might have you think, or what you might assume by looking at the clickbait thumbnails of my older videos, the night stuff, as evidenced by this whole video, was not one of the things I didn't like about the new chapters. In fact, it was by far my favorite stuff in the new chapters, as again, evidenced by this whole video. There's some stuff I didn't love about it, but really that's pretty much just the Closet Knight stuff, which I've already talked about, and also that I don't think how the plot twists themselves were handled were very good. Namely, I think with how things turned out, the Chapter 1 and 2 endings are now much lamer in retrospect, with Kris not having actually made the fountains, but still working with the Knight to the level that if they were just the Knight themselves, very little would actually change in the plot. Especially the Chapter 1 ending, because it's like, Kris takes out their knife, and then what? They put it away and eat the pie with a different knife? Because 1, this knife doesn't look like the same one, and 2, Toriel takes it away, but Kris still has their pocket knife, so like, that's dumb. You know, I get the feeling that I'm the only one that even feels this way or cares about any of this. And really, it's not that big of a deal. I only really care this much because I was left on these cliffhangers for years, and I thought they were really cool, well-done plot twists and cliffhangers. I think going back on them at all, on any level, is lame. Keep in mind, we didn't go back on them so much that it actually ruins the story. The truth is, I do think Toby took the literal one approach, where he could go back on them a little bit without ruining the story. And this exact outcome was again something I saw coming, even back then. But now to finally wrap this up for real this time, I want to talk a little bit about the video itself. I've worked really hard to get this video out and make it as good as possible. And you know, it's a really long video, it took a long time to make. And I know that some of my fans have wondered what took me so long, and I can hope that just based on the length of the video, that you understand what took me so long. And I hope it was good enough to have been worth the wait. Because after the new chapters came out, I didn't want to push out a video full of hot takes and half-baked theories that I end up not agreeing with 2 months after I put it out. And I did try making a video where I just go over my old theories and what I got right and wrong. And I wrote some stuff for it, and I read it back, and I was like, wow, this is boring, no one is going to want to watch this. And so I threw it all out and started over. Then I spent a bunch of time analyzing and thinking about the game, and then I made this video. And as I was making this video, I just kept coming up with more things I wanted to say and adding more and more to the video. And I really want it to be perfect, because I don't want to look back at this video not long down the line and be like, oh man, I can't believe I didn't mention this thing, or I really wish I had said this differently, or something else instead. But I also know that no matter what, that will happen. Because it always happens. There's always something in every video I've ever made that I wish I did differently. And I already know that there is way more I could have said about this topic, and that there is only so much I can say about something in any given video. Because the truth is that all of my videos are really only ever the tip of the iceberg of all the thoughts I've had about this game. Which was why, honestly, I was pretty annoyed that my second favorite Knight theory ended up being right. Not because it was only like 90% of what I wanted and not 100%, but because it was literally my number 2 pick. I called it but never made a full video on it, and only ever talked about the theory on a recording was briefly on a live stream one time. Like, yeah, I'm smashing my head against the wall for not hedging my bets better and making a video where I addressed Kris Dess multi-Knight, when I knew that was a viable option. I totally could have talked about it in a regular video, I just never brought it up. But really, it probably wouldn't have made a big difference, considering my video where I totally called Chapter 4 being about Gerson and the Lord of the Hammer, and it didn't even get 20k views, so whatever. In the end, I feel like I got more or less everything that I wanted, so I feel like I won. Even though it does feel like I won in the most annoying way possible, where only I know that I did. But hey, I was also the guy who said this. But it's okay, because this is why we have backup theories. See, that's the thing Big Theory doesn't want you to know about. You can make as many theories as you want, you only need one of them to be right to win. So really, maybe the second pick is just as good as the first. Especially since the main reason why it was my second pick was not because I thought it would make for a worse story, but because it required so many more baseless assumptions. Like, the reason why my first pick was solo Kris Knight was really just Occam's razor. Because in order to come to the right answer, you first had to assume that Kris could be the Knight, because almost all the anti-Kris Knight arguments people made up would also debunk this theory if they were true. But then after that, you still had to assume, based on nothing, that Kris was only one of 2 knights, and that the quote-unquote real knight is Dess that was lost, but Kris found her before the start of the game, and that is what the Find Her stuff was teasing, and not that finding Dess would be a plot point in the actual game. And this would also only make sense for you if you also assumed a bunch of other stuff about Kris and Dess's relationship, also based on almost nothing. Stuff like that they were knife buddies and best friends forever. Otherwise, the knight using a knife and being Dess, instead of just being Kris, doesn't make sense. And it's just like, yeah, why would you go ahead and assume all that extra stuff over just going, yeah, it's probably just Kris, especially since both theories cover basically the same major plot points and themes. Plot points like what the knight is doing and why, and themes like the roles of knights and damsels in stories. Like, it's almost the exact same story, just more complex. And I'm sitting here being like, well, I mean, who could have guessed all of that? And it's just like, oh wait, I did. Which is kind of why I've had a lot of complex feelings about the new chapters and what we ended up getting with the knight stuff. Because I can't even be like, oh, how did I not consider this? Because I did consider it. I think there was definitely some things that solo Kris Knight would be able to do that I think could have been cool. But there's also stuff that's unique to what we got, like Kris and Dess getting to work together, and Dess getting a more active role in the overall story, which is stuff I really love. Anyway, yeah, I liked the new chapters. I'm happy with what we got. I say new chapters as if this video didn't take so long to make that we're now closer to the release of Chapter 5 than we are to when Chapter 3 and 4 came out. You know, it's funny, I thought the Dess boss fight would be like Demyx, but it ended up being more like Lingering Will. Okay, but yeah, at some point I just gotta stop talking. Wait, one more thing. So, you want to know how I actually started theorizing about Kris and Dess being close friends and how their relationship is going to be the centerpiece of the plot? Well, it's because one day I saw this image, and I thought it was really funny, and I went, I bet this is what Kris and Dess's relationship was like. And then I started actually thinking about it, and what their dynamic was like, and then I made all those theories about it, one of which being that Dess was the knight, and that Kris was working with her as a second knight, and that's why they made the fountain. Anyway, that's it. That's the real end. So now it's time to again ask you to like, comment, and subscribe, and support the channel on Ko-Fi or Patreon if you want to see more. Also, if you want to watch more content from me that isn't old and dated, I actually already have hours of content up on my good friend Sharuba's channel, where we have been going over his Deltarune theory survey. Sharuba made the largest, most wide-reaching theory survey ever in the Chapter 2 era, collecting over 2,400 submissions, and we've been going over the results in videos talking about the theories, how they have aged, and how popular they were, with the largest dataset ever collected to back those claims up. So make sure to check those videos out. Links to that and everything else important are in the description. And lastly, I want to give thanks to all the people that helped make this video possible. First, I want to give a thank you to I Hate the Culmination of Our Being on Twitter for letting me use their animation of Kris and the Knight beating up the vessel. They made other cool animations of Kris and the Knight, so you should check them out. I want to thank my friend DeltaNDestiny again for both letting me use their art in the video, and also making so much art for me in general. And I want to thank my friend Zenny for making the Knife Fighting Friday art for this video. This was kind of a joke between us that ended up making it into the video. And since I'm going to start doing supporter shoutouts, it's only right that I thank the one person who's been supporting me monthly during this long hiatus. Thank you, Visible Wind, for supporting the channel, even though I think you might have just forgotten to cancel. If you're hearing this now and you want to cancel, I understand, but thank you anyway. Your support has been greatly appreciated. And finally, I want to give a thank you to my friend Wow It's Very Cool for making the thumbnail and all of the chestnut character art used in the video. This video would not have been made without her help, so Thank you so much, WoW. And one more thing. Thank you for watching my video.